The signs were all there. The warnings were loud and clear. The loudest amongst us made their voices heard. And in the first week of December, the worst fears were realized. The concern was completely justified. With the release of Metroid Prime 4, Nintendo's 2025 ends with a quiet and somber humming. And unfortunately, the somber atmosphere is not felt in the game of Metroid Prime 4, rather it's felt amongst a damaged fandom. This was supposed to be the game. This was supposed to be the title. One of the few first-party titles available this year that were meant to be for both Switch 1 and Switch 2 users, to be enjoyed by the blind fanboys and the disgruntled cynics alike. Now, in fairness, the last title was Pokemon, but we don't count that crap around here. No, instead, Metroid Prime 4 was a title that many of us had been waiting for, at least since 2017, but more realistically, closer to 20 years. Whether you're somebody that first got introduced into the series with the GameCube and enjoyed it, became a fan during the days of the Metroid Prime trilogy on the Wii, or perhaps you were there in that very moment where they first showed the title screen for Metroid Prime 4 back in 2017. The latest Metroid Prime title has been dangled in front of the fandom for longer than any game should have any right to do so. It was a game that was completely scrapped during development and restarted, a game meant to be launching with the twilight of the console that it was originally supposed to be on, as well as a launch title for the new console of the following generation. But despite the delays, despite the 2025 launch year, the game releases looking like a time capsule. There are many moments during the entirety of the experience of Prime 4 where a player may feel that same sense of wonder and enjoyment that they felt back in 2008. And it's largely because this is a game that looks like it belongs in 2008. There are some gorgeous moments in this title, visuals that look very nice for the original Switch at least. But back in 2008, where game developers gave a damn, many of them were punching well above their weight. And now with even one of Nintendo's greatest studios, Retro Studios, punching well below their weight, the majority of the quality of Prime 4 does not look like a title that had been worked on for the past decade. It looks more like a title that was completed a decade ago and put into storage. It plays like a title that was supposed to come out in 2019 on a Nintendo Switch, mimicking all of the overdone features that we saw in Breath of the Wild, containing slapstick comedic moments that align with the hype felt during the years of Infinity War and Endgame. We end up in this weird timeline where all of a sudden I'm looking back at Metroid Other M and wondering if we can go back to a time where Nintendo had self-respect, where the one thing that you could still not necessarily criticize about Nintendo was the passion and the effort they put into their titles. And yet here we are, another $70 cash grab. $100 if you want to listen to music while roaming through the wide and vast empty desert that would make Halo 3 players look down upon in disgust. Although, as a credit to Nintendo, at least when people buy those amiibos for $30, it's one of the few times a purchase from Nintendo allows you to actually own the product that you buy. I had hope for Metroid Prime 4, genuinely. I'm a pretty late Metroid fan. When I was younger, the 2D Metroid titles used to scare the crap out of me, but around 2017 I decided to play through the entirety of the franchise. I spent way more time on the 2D titles than the 3D titles, but with the oncoming Metroid Prime 4, I was all in. I excitedly waited for years for them to release the trilogy on the Nintendo Switch. They gave us Prime 1, I thought they were coming for sure at that point, but we only got the first game. But I fell hard for Metroid. I got really into the lore, I replayed the title a few times. I even have a 2D Metroid retrospective on this very channel. You can find it in my playlist if you're interested. And the more that I played Metroid, the more I loved the franchise, the more I learned to love an entire genre that I didn't grow up enjoying. Metroid Dread became one of my favorite games on the Nintendo Switch library. A game that I enjoyed so much that I intentionally played it without any intention of making a video on it. I just wanted to enjoy the game as a gamer, not necessarily as a YouTuber. And Prime 4 was supposed to be the same way. And there was a lot of hype for me and for many others going into the launch of this title. But as we got closer to release, that hype slowly became concern, hesitance even. No matter how blind somebody tried to be going into the launch of this title, the screenshots of the desert alone were enough to give you concern about the open world nature of this title. The thought that if this was the effort they were going to be putting into what is effectively the hub of the game, and they were willing to show that to people, was enough to make you think about what little effort they put everywhere else. And yet, that wasn't even the worst of it. Miles Mckenzie and all of Samus's other buddies All were front and center during the presentations and the previews, and people stood on top of mountains and yelled and screamed that this would ruin the title. But the optimists suggested this would strictly be part of a tutorial. Metroid is a game best enjoyed when you're alone. It should just be you and Samus. That's it. They strayed from this a bit during the trilogy, but it never necessarily felt this offensive. Even in some of the 2D titles, you'd find people complain about the amount of help that you're getting or the linear path that you're required to take. But in comparison to what's being offered in Metroid Prime 4, suddenly it makes those older titles feel a lot more true to the formula. There are words that always stick out to me when I think about the Metroid series. Atmospheric, ambiance, solitude. It's esoteric, but it's known by legacy Metroid fans. And unfortunately, I do have to classify us as legacy Metroid fans. Because much like with many other depressing downturns in all of our favorite media, there is a split now between the modern fan and the classic fan. Metroid Prime 4 can be a fun game. It may very well be enjoyed by a newcomer to the franchise. If you are somebody that did not find any flaws in Pokemon Legends ZA and thought people were blowing that garbage out of proportion, you very likely could play Metroid Prime 4 and think that it is the game of the year. But for legacy Metroid fans, this is not the title they were waiting for. I had a lot of concern leading up to this release, and most of those concerns were blown wide open when the reviews came out, and even more so when users started discussing the title. It's very hard to navigate the Nintendo sphere at this point in time, especially if you're a fan of Nintendo games. Because the unfortunate reality is that every single Nintendo game right now is going to be blown and glazed way out of proportion. So you never truly know if a game is worth spending money on, or if the people that are saying it's good are the same type of people that have been glazing everything else that's come out this year. I thought it would be difficult to find true Metroid fans that are willing to criticize the fandom. Ones that either don't have a hidden agenda, or they're not just shriveling up into a corner and complaining because something was ruined in their nostalgia. But it was surprisingly a lot easier than I expected. But I should make something very clear. While the desert was a concern for me, how ugly that looked and the fact that it was like a hub world with Zelda shrines around it for some reason, the intrusive nature of the NPCs, the feeling and vibes that I knew would very likely take a hit going into this title. There was only one thing that I was holding on to in hopes that it would make this title work out for the better, and it was how well they would apply the philosophy of the Metroidvania. Metroidvanias are something that I've discussed quite a bit in many of my videos, primarily the retrospective videos, obviously. I even briefly mentioned them in my Donkey Kong Country 64 retrospective that I uploaded a few days ago. You can watch that on Nintendine Plus. But to quickly recap some of the points that I've talked about over the years, the creativity behind a Metroidvania is the way that it allows you to walk into a room that you may have been in 3, 4, or 5 times. And every time you re-enter that location, due to how much strength you might have gained, the powers that you might have learned, or the experience you might have now going through the title, every re-entry would feel like you were wearing a different pair of glasses. You were seeing something you couldn't see before. You were searching in ways that you couldn't search before. This not only makes backtracking effective and feel less like a chore, but it also makes it very exciting. Realizing there were secrets and power-ups and weapons all around you in a room that you were in when you were just starting the game. It's one of the most incredible feelings that one can get when they're playing a Metroid title. It makes you feel the growth that your character that you're controlling is feeling in the title. And amongst all of this, with the evolutions that you go through as a character, with the abilities that you discover, and the power-ups gained, you are now able to unlock doors or discover new pathways and build off new branches that you previously couldn't fathom existing. The unlocking of new doors and the ability to access new areas is the simplest aspect of a Metroidvania, but the way that it's implemented makes all of the difference. What do I mean by this? In a good Metroidvania, a player might discover an explosive. They may return to an older stage and decide to use their newfound ability to defeat an enemy. Using said explosive, they might notice a secret where they could collect something. With their curiosity, they head towards that path, and where they might have thought they would be rewarded with missiles or some health, they end up accidentally discovering an entire new pathway, and somehow this pathway is not just a secret to a bonus room. It's the route that you're meant to take to progress through this adventure. That sense of accomplishment where your curiosity leads to you finding where you need to go, with no help but your own experimentation and understanding of the game, gives you an intrinsic reward that makes a Metroidvania special. But unfortunately, that's not how it's implemented in Metroid Prime 4. Metroid Prime 4 implements it in a way that exists in games that aren't even Metroidvanias. It does it in a way that's just applicable to any adventure title. You pass by a door that's locked. You're hinted that there must be a key to this door. You continue along your path, eventually finding whatever this key is. Whether that key is an ability, a power-up, a generic MacGuffin. No matter what that key might be, you know where you're going back to. And you take that key, and you go back to the door and you open it, and you progress. This is what I mean by a Metroidvania at its simplest form. Moments like that do exist in Metroidvanias, but it's not the primary way to progress in Metroidvanias. It is, however, the primary way to get around in Metroid Prime 4. And the worst part is, even with that simplicity, if there's a chance that you might not have realized where you need to go, which door you need to unlock, where you need to backtrack towards, your best friend Miles is there to nudge you in the right direction. And what we have left is just a bastardized version of the genre that we all love, of the franchise that we have all been eagerly awaiting for it to return. How long have some of you been waiting for this? How long were we waiting for Donkey Kong to come back into 3D, only to see them completely change the way that you play a Donkey Kong title, making it a fun title but not a 3D Donkey Kong, and most importantly making it one of the easiest games out this year, only surpassed by future Nintendo releases. How many of these design choices are no longer being made by developers, and instead being made by higher-ups who want to make sure they can reach the blue ocean? You know, it wasn't too long ago that Nintendo had a pathway towards reaching the masses, and the path they used to take was innovation, passion, the pure gaming experience. Their methodology now is at its simplest form. Stick to whatever has been tried and tested, take zero risks, make it as easy as possible for 40-year-olds and their 5-year-old children, and most importantly, cut every corner imaginable to save every penny you can while charging more than anybody else in the industry. This is the modern Nintendo formula, and it appeals to the modern Nintendo fan. Maybe this was inevitable. Maybe this is always what Nintendo was heading towards. But in 2025, it could not be clearer. We started the year off with another title that was originally made by Retro Studios, Donkey Kong Country Returns HD. One of the most overpriced and laziest ports of any title that came out onto the Switch, a console that was full of overpriced and lazy ports. On that same time, there's a reveal of the Nintendo Switch 2, a console that was just basically a bigger Switch, featuring the most risk-free title that you can imagine on a Nintendo console in Mario Kart World. Mario Kart is great, don't get me wrong, but I've made this analogy before. Mario Kart is French fries. The fries are the best-selling item on the menu, and they always will be. But you don't go to the restaurant to buy French fries. You go there because you want to get a burger, a steak, some wraps, maybe a sub. That's what excites you. The fries just come with whatever you purchase. It's basic. It's a safe bet. We get our first Direct, and between that and the launch of the Switch 2, whatever goodwill the fandom had with Nintendo was slowly being ripped away. The launch year lineup looked exciting for a first announcement, but everybody expected more until we hit September and found out that this was it. With 3 niche titles carrying on for the holiday after having nothing come out up until September 30th. And then one after the other, all 3 of those titles, they underwhelm in one way or another. Your Warriors fans will buy Hyrule Warriors, but nobody else will. Your Kirby Air Riders fans will enjoy Kirby Air Riders, but it won't be that popular. What was unfortunate, though, is that even the Metroid fans are not liking Metroid. A franchise that was dormant and is now going to remain dormant even longer because it's not going to succeed the way Nintendo wants it to. The same way that it happened back in the 2000s. But if this is the way that they want to bring back Metroid, the way they want to preserve the legacy of Samus, maybe they should just let it lay dormant. Because so far, game after game, franchise after franchise, Nintendo's finding a way to take these beloved IPs and completely souring the way the fandom feels about it. Whether it's in the game design, the added content, the lack of content, the oversimplification of every single title, or perhaps, most importantly, the fact that every single one of these games is littered with corporate greed. Metroid Prime 4 was perhaps the single beacon of hope that could have repaired 2025. It could have been the single title to completely undo all of the negative perception that Nintendo has had over the past year. All of the disgust that Nintendo has had with the fandom could have been undone with a single game. And all they had to do was do what they've always done. Make a good game that appeals to the Nintendo fan, the legacy Nintendo fan. But they've shown us that Metroid Prime 4 is beyond repair. And likewise, Nintendo is beyond repair.